Cīrulīti mazputniņi negul ceļa maliņā, cīrulīti mazputniņi.
Hello and welcome once again to another episode of 177 Nations of Tasmania. Latvians were amongst the first migrants to come to Australia in the late 40s and early 50s from post-war Europe. Between 1947 and 1952, almost 20,000 Latvians arrived in Australia. A small portion of these came to Tasmania, including the renowned photographer Peter Dombrovskis, amongst others. My guest for this episode is Ieva, whose family were amongst that wave of Latvian immigrants who came to Australia at the time. Ieva's family escaped Latvia in somewhat dramatic fashion during World War II as the German army was retreating from Latvia under threat from the approaching Red Army. Later in life, she would marry a fellow Latvian living in Tasmania, where she has lived for around 60 years, and for much of it has been actively maintaining Latvian traditions and language. As you can imagine, maintaining these traditions with a small Latvian community on the edge of the world is a tough challenge. To hear more about Ieva's family's hairy escape and Latvian cultural traditions that are preserved in Tasmania, please stay tuned.
We left Latvia in 1944 in October, and it was because the Russian army was coming into Latvia and the German army was moving out because the Russians were defeating the German army. So we were in between the two, and the Russian army was burning our town where we were living, and there was nothing to do but get out.
And how did you get out? And where did you go?
As a matter of fact, we had quite an adventure. First of all, my father was working in Riga, and we were in Cesis, which was about 200 kilometres north. And he said, I have ordered a truck that you can ride to get to Riga on, and after that then we'll work out how we get to on the boat to get out. So my mother, with 6 children, as well as my father's mother, we got on this truck that was loaded with logs and bags of cement, and we were on the way to Riga, but we had to go on smaller roads because the German army were occupying the highways. However, as the truck was travelling and trying to keep away from the German transport, it veered to the left and toppled over, and we were all thrown. Us children, we were sitting on top of the logs on the back of the truck, and my mother and a 2-month-old brother were in the front. However, we were all thrown out under these logs and under the bags of cement, and fortunately there was the German army close by who came to the rescue, and we all ended up in hospital with various injuries. My mother was very badly hurt in the head, and though most of us only had minor injuries, we got home. But my grandmother had a broken hip, and she died a couple of days later, and my mother was in hospital, unable to move. And while we were all checking out who was badly hurt and who wasn't, my older sister started to say, but where's our 2-month-old baby? Where's the brother? And nobody could find him. And in the end, he was stuck between 2 logs with lots of white lime, I suppose it was, all over him. However, they took him out and he was fine.
Wow.
So we all went back to our other grandparents' home and stayed there. So that was our first attempt to get out. It must have been only a week or 2 later. Our father came home, and he and my other grandfather had to bury his mother because there were no more workers in the cemeteries. They had to do that themselves. There was no more transport to be had. So my father and grandfather built sort of a hood on a horse cart, and we were going to go by horse and cart to Riga. Unfortunately, my mother was still in hospital, and when we were all packed to go, then my other grandparents decided to come with us as well. So they had the horse, took a cow, because of my little brother who needed milk, and we all went in this horse and cart, and on the way past the hospital, my father just picked Mother up and put her in. So in the cart there was Mother, my little brother, and we were twins, 4-year-old. And then there were another sister who was 8, a brother who was 9, and another sister who was 14. And they had to walk as did my grandparents. So they all walked from Cesis about 200 kilometres to Riga.
Wow, that's a long way to walk.
Yeah. On the way, there was still the German army retreating, and we had to go through forests, not on the highways, through back roads. Some places, because it took a lot longer than it would have taken on the truck, of course, some places we could stop and could stay in farmers' barns, but other people weren't very welcoming, and we just stayed on the side of the road or under the horse cart. And so we got to Riga. By that time there were no boats going from Riga, so we had to go another 240 kilometres to a port that was called Liepāja, and that's what we did. After a week or so in Riga, just having a rest, then we set off again in the horse and cart to the port where we knew there were still ships taking the German army back to Germany. About halfway, the cart came to grief, and they had to do a lot of repairs. And then a bit further, our relatives, my mother's sister, used to live about halfway to this Liepāja port. And so we thought we could stop there, but the German army had already occupied their house, and the family had moved except for the husband, who was still there. So we could stay there for a couple of days, and fortunately from there the train was still going to the port. So then we had to leave the horse and cow and everything else and just took the cases that we could carry, and we got to the port and got onto a ship that was carrying German soldiers back to Germany. They loaded also their horses in the very bottom, and then us refugees on top of the horses, and then the soldiers had the best accommodation at the top. However, we were fortunate to get to Germany safely, though many boats were bombed on the way.
Iecels tevi karietē, novedīsi vādzemē, iecels tevi karietē, novedīsi vādzemē, novedīsi vādzemē.
So you made it to Germany, and what was the situation in Germany at the time?
In Germany, we were in a small town that was, as a matter of fact, also being bombed by the English at that time, because they were fighting the Germans. Father got some work there, as did my older sister. My mother was still very sick. She had a brain injury, and she couldn't walk at all. So we were there for a while, and then we realised that we were very close to the eastern border of Germany, where the Russians were coming in. And because my mother and father could speak German, they managed to be in touch with the American army to make sure that we got away from the eastern part of Germany and got into the American zone.
And so what happened then? And how long were you in Germany?
We were in Germany for 6 years, and one of the best places was called Sengwarden or Meerbeck, which was a little village that the Americans had taken over, and they had cleared it of all German people, which was rather sad. And the houses were given to us refugees, a lot of Latvians, also Lithuanians, Estonians, and the German people. We were told that they were ousted from their homes because of something that they had done to some Americans. And we weren't allowed out of this little village because the Germans who lived all around weren't very happy about us taking over, of course. Sometimes we children went into the woods, and these German farmers came at us with rakes and scythes, and we were very scared, so we had to be very careful where we went. The Germans were allowed to come through the village into church every Sunday to walk in a group and attend their church. And in this village we had, I don't know how many hundreds of Latvians there. And of course, Latvians have the tradition of, as soon as a group gets together, they have to start making a choir, making a theatre and a school. So this is where we started our schooling in Latvia, in Meerbeck, and also Girl Guides, and there were quite a lot of people who were actors, actresses, and they set up a theatre group. So it was quite an enjoyable time for about 3 years, I think, or 3.5. And after that, people slowly started to think about going somewhere else out of Germany. Some went to America. And then this village was given back to the Germans, and we had to move to different camps. They were often army barracks that we were moved to. So we moved probably 5 or 6 different army camps before we could apply to come to Australia. And that was in 1950.
How was the process of coming to Australia? Was that something that your family chose, or was that just kind of luck?
Well, we wanted to go to Canada or America. Our grandparents were with us for a while in those camps, but they managed to get a visa to Canada, where our aunt and uncle were, and another aunt and uncle and family went to America. So that's where we wanted to go as well. We weren't accepted for some medical reason, so our parents had to decide to go somewhere else. And they applied to go to Ethiopia, or Abyssinia, I think it was called in those days. And then they realised that it was a mistake to do that and applied to Australia. And Australia accepted us, and that's how we came over. Boarded a ship in Wilhelmshaven, and it took a month, just over a month later. We arrived should have stopped in Melbourne. No, we stopped in Fremantle first and should have stopped in Melbourne. There was some strike on in Melbourne, so we went to Sydney, and there was a migrant camp in Bathurst. and that's where we were for the first year.
Iecels tevi karietē, novedīsi vādzemē, iecels tevi karietē, novedīsi vādzemē, novedīsi vādzemē.
And what do you remember about the migrant camp in Bathurst?
The accommodation was very sparse. It was in...
It was an old military camp or training centre.
It was a military camp, yes, an army camp. It was all right. I mean, we'd be used to army camps in Germany, so it was okay. It was very cold in the winter time and very hot in the summertime. And we had to go for our meals to a dining room that was for everybody. There was no dining in your own rooms. And for the first time, we were very happy to see as much food as we could eat. It was mainly white bread, which we weren't used to, which we were usually having rye bread and things like that, but children adapt to everything. And on the tables there was always lots of jam. We thought, oh, this is great, just pile it onto the bread, and then we found out it was marmalade, which was very bitter, and we didn't like it at all. So, and we had to catch a bus to the nearest village, Bathurst, to go to school, and we were given 2 slices of white bread with mature cheese, which was very strong and we didn't like, and 1 apple or else 1 orange, and that was our lunch. My older brother and sister went to Bathurst school, and we younger ones had to go to the village school, which is called Kelso, but that was all right. It was a 1-teacher school, and he was a lovely teacher, and his wife helped. They lived just next to the school, and his wife helped out with things like girls' sewing and handwork and cooking and things like that. I think she also played music. But it was a happy time in the school, and that's where we started to learn English.
What had your parents been doing previously in Latvia?
My mother in Latvia was a dentist, and before that she studied languages, and she worked in a library, and then she became a dentist after that. And my father worked in an ice works factory. He was an electrician.
Was it unusual for a woman in Latvia to be like a dentist or something so highly trained?
In Latvia, it wasn't unusual at all, but it was unusual when we came to Australia.
Yeah, that's what I thought.
Because she still wanted to continue her dentistry, but first of all, she had to attend English classes. She spoke Russian, German, Latvian, Latin and French, but not English, so she had to learn English. And when we went to Adelaide, she then decided to apply to university to get back to dentistry, and she had to do 5 years of study to regain her dental qualifications. And she was the only woman in that course, all young fellows, and she was in her 50s, I suppose.
Wow.
And her name is Regina, so they used to call her Queenie.
Well, she must have been very determined to go through all that.
She was determined, yes.
Especially with 6 kids as well.
Yes, she was. My oldest sister by that time was living on her own. She was 20. So she from Bathurst, she went to Sydney and she got married and started a family there, but later when we went to live in Adelaide, then she came to live in Adelaide as well. But yeah, so it was 5 children who had to be schooled.
Iecels tevi karietē, novedīsi vādzemē, iecels tevi karietē, novedīsi vādzemē, novedīsi vādzemē.
So we went to Adelaide, and we lived with this. He was a Lutheran pastor, and we lived with this family for about 6 months, I think, until we bought a house of our own. And there was a Lutheran, German Lutheran minister who was very, very helpful to migrants, and he organised a loan, and he organised this house for us. So then we moved to a house of our own, and we continued schooling, and Mother continued her studies as well as working at night in a mental hospital, and Father was working, and that's how we started out in Adelaide.
Yeah, from what I've little research I've done, quite a lot of Latvians went to Adelaide in the
yes, there's
50s.
a big community still in Adelaide, and though we were speaking English in school, we were all involved in Latvian choir, Latvian Girl Guides, Latvian theatre, and we all had Latvian friends. So yes, it was. It's, as I say, it was a big community and still is very active. And in Adelaide, as in Melbourne and Sydney, they have their own community house and church and different sporting groups.
So there was still quite a bit of practicing of Latvian traditions and culture still.
Very much, yeah. As I say, my mother had to do a lot of study for the dentistry to be able to pass that, but my father was never very good at English. He did learn to read English, but because he spoke German and Russian as well as Latvian, but he was never a very sociable person outside of the family, and so he never had much contact with other Australians other than at work. But yeah, we all got there.
Iecels tevi karietē, novedīsi vādzemē, iecels tevi karietē, novedīsi vādzemē, novedīsi vādzemē.
I came to Tasmania in 1963 when I married a Latvian boy from Tasmania. What happened in the 70s, the Latvian communities on the mainland, Melbourne, Sydney, Adelaide, Brisbane, had Latvian cultural festivals, and Arnold, my husband, came to Adelaide for a visit, and that's where we happened to meet. And then I came for a visit here, and he came for another visit to Adelaide, and that's how it happened. And then we got married and came to live here.
And what was Tasmania like at that stage for?
Tasmania was lovely. There was the big mountain and beautiful scenery everywhere. There weren't nearly as many Latvians though, which I missed. But Arnold lived with his parents. He is an only child, and of course we all continued to speak Latvian in the home. They didn't own any property though. They had community get-togethers in private homes, and once a month, because most Latvians were Lutheran, we had a Lutheran pastor came from Melbourne to take services here, and most of the Latvians met together there or in the church hall. We formed a small choir and a folk dancing group that I led for quite a few years. Unfortunately, as the children got to past teenagers, a lot of them decided to move to the mainland, and we lost them. And a lot of them didn't keep up the language at home, and some of the parents thought that their children needed to learn English and spoke English at home as well, so it was a pity that in some homes the language was lost as well.
Iecels tevi karietē, novedīsi vādzemē, iecels tevi karietē, novedīsi vādzemē, novedīsi vādzemē. Novedīsi vādzemē, tur tev liksim.
So we still have a Latvian community. I was the president for about 35 years until last year or the year before, when I handed the reins over to a younger person. So we continue having regular get-togethers, probably 3, 4, maybe 5 times a year. And anyone who comes from Adelaide or Sydney or Melbourne can always find somebody who speaks Latvian here. So.
And what sort of events or cultural traditions still take place?
Well, as I said, we do have visits from some important people. We just had our president, Latvian president, or just ex-president, here. Our National Day is the 18th of November, and though we can't all celebrate on that day, we celebrate as close as we can to the date. And he was here on the 21st to celebrate with us. And other than that, we often celebrate Midsummer Festival, which is in the middle of winter here, unfortunately. But we often manage to go somewhere where we can have a big bonfire or something where we can sing and dance around. And yes, other than those two, we don't have any other significant celebrations.
Maybe you could just explain what happens on Midsummer, because I know there are certain Latvian traditions I think I've read about.
Well, usually we make garlands for women and men. Women usually have flower garlands to wear, and men have ones out of oak leaves that they wear. Usually there is a bonfire or some kind of a fireworks. In Latvia, they make a wheel that will roll, that's a burning wheel that will roll down a hill. That's quite significant. Or sometimes they'll put a burning fire up on a pole. Of course, lots of traditional cheese, especially for Midsummer. We make a traditional cheese with caraways, and of course the bacon buns we have those all year, but they are a traditional food. And lots of folk dancing around the fire or nearby. Or folk dances are ones that children are taught right from the word go. And you don't have to be good at it, you just participate, which is the main thing. And there are particular songs for Midsummer that Latvians have. Like folk songs, but particularly for that time of the year.
Yeah, from what I've read, singing and dancing seems to be a very big part of Latvian culture.
Very, very much a big part. Latvians say that they won all wars by singing. We still have very big choir culture, and Latvian choirs are among the best choir singers in the world. They take choir singing very, very seriously, and there's not one school or one group that doesn't have a choir. They all have choirs, and as adults as well. Every university, every big social group have choirs. Every 5 years we have a big cultural festival in Latvia, and this started in the 1920s, and then in the 40s it had to be stopped because the Russians didn't want to hear Latvian music at all or have anything. It was actually banned. But when we got our independence back in the 1990s, it has started again. And as a matter of fact, the first festival was in 1990 in Latvia, and that's a big choir and a dancing festival with parades and anything that you could imagine. We were lucky to be invited to Latvia as a choir from Australia, and I was lucky to participate in that. So my twin sister and I both took part, and we sang in this 10,000 people choir.
Oh, wow.
In Latvia. At the time, Latvia was just on the verge of regaining independence, and nobody was sure exactly if it would happen or not. But there were lots of people from America, Canada, Sweden, from everywhere, and we were all hoping that this would clinch the independence, and it did happen. But there were aeroplanes going over the top while we were singing, and we never knew whether they were Latvian or Russian aeroplanes. But anyway, it was a great adventure, and something that we'll never forget.
And was that the first time you'd returned to Latvia? Or?
It was, yes, after 1940.
I imagine that in that era it would have been very difficult to have returned in the Soviet times, if not impossible.
Oh, yes. Well, my father did go back in 1976 because his sister was still in Latvia, and she was very ill, and she wrote and asked whether he could come over or go over, and he did, but it was very strict, and he really didn't enjoy it at all. But he was there before she passed away, which was good. And there's like when we left our grandparents in Germany, that was at 10 years old. That was the last that we saw them.
Right.
So my mother did travel to America to see her mother. But father had passed away by that time, but it was because we didn't have a lot of money for travel in those days anyway, so it was difficult to go to see them.
Iecels tevi karietē, novedīsi vādzemē, iecels tevi karietē, novedīsi vādzemē, novedīsi vādzemē. Novedīsi vādzemē, tur tev liksim.
What was your feeling when you went back there, and was Latvia as you had expected it?
It was a bit scary. My husband didn't want to come, didn't want to go. My twin sister and I decided, because we were accepted in the Australian Latvian choir, we said we're definitely going. So he decided to come as well, which was very nice. We went as a group from Sydney with all the Latvians together, which was a great help. And we had an experience. We were in Helsinki, and we were supposed to go by boat to Estonia and then by bus to Latvia. Well, from Helsinki, something happened with a booking, because there were about, I don't know how many in our choir, probably 35 or 40, and they couldn't get us on the boat. And so we had to travel by train through St. Petersburg and then to Estonia. And that was very scary. As we crossed the Russian border, there was like all our passports were taken away and checked and rechecked, and are you this person? And it was very... So anyway, when we got to Riga, we were only allowed to stay in one hotel, nowhere else. Even if you had relatives, you weren't allowed to stay with anyone else. So it was all very restricted. You weren't allowed to go out of Riga at all, no travel anywhere. But we were happy just to be there, and everywhere was Latvian, though there were a lot of Russians there, but we tried to keep away from them. And as it happened, we met up with some people who we'd been responding with, and after the festival, he organised for us to be able to stay on for a bit longer and live somewhere else and to travel. But it was because somebody knew somebody and had a way of finding things out and organising. But we were told, no, you can't, nothing else, you know. Anyway, it all worked out.
And have you been to Latvia since then?
We've been back 5 times altogether, yeah.
When was the last time?
Last time was in 2012.
Okay.
My grandfather's house from where we left Latvia was 100 years old. That was back in our hands. Actually, my twin sister owns that now, and the house was completely gutted and restored, and it was 100 years old. So 4 of us, my twin sister, myself, and my eldest sister and my younger brother and my husband, we all went, and my twin sister's husband, 6 of us, we all went back there to celebrate 100 years to this grandfather's house. So that was in 2012. And then what we did was we travelled by minivan the way that we walked.
Oh, okay.
That 1940, that route that we took, and that was quite an adventure. Yes, because my oldest sister remembered exactly where we'd gone, and we also had a diary from my grandfather, which way we had gone, so we knew where to go.
Iecels tevi karietē, novedīsi vādzemē, iecels tevi karietē, novedīsi vādzemē, novedīsi vādzemē. Novedīsi vādzemē, tur tev.
So these days, to what extent are Latvian culture and traditions still kept alive in Tasmania?
Not a lot, as I say. We still enjoy our get-togethers and speak Latvian, but because a lot of Latvians now are either married or with a partner who doesn't speak Latvian, we often have to do translations, either speak in Latvian and then provide a written translation. This is what our president had to do, or everybody speaks English, which isn't what we really would like to do. Sometimes the people who don't speak Latvian have to put up with us speaking only Latvian, but they know that that's what we're going to do. I mean, the songs that we sing or listen to, you know, you can't translate those in English, so they just have to live with it and put up with it.
But do any sort of younger generation, maybe second or third generation, have interest or anything like that?
Very few. Yes, unfortunately, our own children who all spoke Latvian at home prefer to speak English, and they think in English. They don't think in Latvian, and though they understand the Latvian language, they prefer to speak in English, and all of them are married to English-speaking partners. Yeah, it makes it very difficult, and unless you persevere, unfortunately, the language will slowly be lost, especially here in Tasmania, where we don't have a big Latvian contingent.
What ties do you still have with Latvia, and how do you maintain those?
I have a few friends who are still in Latvia, who are living in Latvia and have been all the time, who I communicate with either through phone now but through letters beforehand. And we've had some people who've come to stay here. Actually, just before we went to Latvia for the very first time, there was a young boy, 18-year-old, who wrote to me and said, could he come and stay with me because he didn't want to go in the Russian army. And I said, yes, that's all right. I said, we're coming to Latvia in 1990. We'll meet your family and we'll meet you and then we'll make a decision. And that's what we did. So we did meet him, and then he came out later that year to stay with us for about 6 months. And then he stayed on longer than that, actually. He stayed with us for 6 months, and then he stayed with someone else and went to Sydney and stayed there and was out of Latvia for quite a long time. And that family we've been in touch with ever since. And then there's another family who wrote to me, and we did meet up with them another year when we were in Latvia, and I've been in touch with them. Also, my husband Arnold's relatives who still live in Latvia, we keep in touch with them.
Okay.
And yes, so quite a few people, either through letters or phone calls mostly these days.
Iecels tevi karietē, novedīsi vādzemē, iecels tevi karietē, novedīsi vādzemē, novedīsi vādzemē. Novedīsi vādzemē, tur tev liksim mežā braukt, novedīsi vādzemē, tur tev liksim mežā braukt, tur tev liksim mežā braukt.